Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar and thank you for joining the session on women's rights. We'll just wait a few more minutes to allow everyone to join. I can see lots of people are arriving. Welcome, welcome. I'll move on to the next slide. So please familiarise yourself with our ground rules. This webinar is provided with simultaneous interpretation, so everyone should select a language room at the bottom, selecting the world icon, and you can select from English, French or Portuguese. Please chat directly to the host, Publish What You Pay Secretariat in the drop-down menu if you have any technical difficulties. And feel free to use the chat page. You'll select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down to introduce yourselves. Please use the Q&A section to ask your questions to the panelists. If someone has asked a question that you are interested to hear the answer to, then please vote for it using the thumbs up icon. By participating in this webinar, you are agreeing to uphold the code of conduct, which will now be shared in the chat. You should see some links to that. Finally, please note that this webinar will be recorded and a link will be made available shortly after. Now, if we're all okay, I will hand over to Indra Tivo, who will be moderating this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Indra Tivo. I'm based in Oslo. I'm a policy and country manager at the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative Secretariat. And I have the huge honor today of moderating a panel with 6 distinguished panelists. So before I introduce them, I just wanted to get back to the overall objective of today's panel, organized in the context of the PWYP Africa Conference. So since 2018, PWYP and other initiatives have really sought to apply a gender perspective to their work. But despite all of these efforts, there's still a very long way to go to ensure that stakeholders place women's rights at the core of the transparency and extractives movement. And so this panel is really about building on the experiences of different stakeholders from civil society, but also from industry and government, to foster a feminist approach to natural resource governance. Apologies in advance to the interpreters. I am often told that I speak too fast, so please flag to me if you want me to slow down. Today's discussion will be structured this way. So first we'll have a first round of questions. We will be asking each panelist to share about their approaches to advancing women's rights and gender equality in the extractive sector, and then a second round of questions where we'll be looking at more innovative approaches to feminist natural resource governance, and then we'll be opening up for questions. So please don't hesitate to drop your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll be addressing those in the Q&A session. So I'm very, very happy today to be with six people that I have met in other contexts. Some I've met for the first time, so I'll be introducing them in alphabetical order. First, Lydia Boalassa from Madagascar. Nice to have you. She's the chairperson of the board of directors of the company Madagascar Consolidated Mining. She's a member of the Chamber of Mines of Madagascar, and she's a member of the EITI multi-stakeholder group as well. She's been part of the Women in Mining and Resources Association of Madagascar and a champion of the Association of Lapidary Women in the southern regions. So thank you for joining us, Lydia. Second, we have with us Melania Chiponda, who's a women's rights activist from Zimbabwe. Welcome, Melania. And she has over 70 years of experience working in the extractive sector with a focus on gender justice and environmental and climate justice. She's worked very closely with women in working class and rural communities and with different collectives and indigenous groups in challenging extractivism as a model for development. So welcome, Melania, and thank you for joining us. Thirdly, Mando Chedaponde is with us as well. She's an Economic and Social Accountability Officer at Caritas Zambia, and she helps coordinate the Publish What You Pay National Secretariat in Zambia. And over the past 2 years, she's been working closely with the ITI multi-stakeholder group, and she's been facilitating a campaign on mining and women's benefits and trying to secure more targeted benefits from extractive revenues for women. So welcome as well, Mando, and thank you so much for joining us. Then we have Abubakar Kuhuma from Guinea. Welcome, Abubakar. He is the director of the Bureau for Strategy and Development of the Ministry of Mines and Geology of Guinea. And he has been in that position since 2016. The bureau that he oversees coordinates all the activities that are linked to the design, the implementation, and the monitoring of mining sector policies, including gender. In fifth position on the list, Mariam Sodambake from Senegal. Welcome, Mariam. She's a human rights activist from Senegal, and she's the president of an association called Citizens Active for Social Justice. She is the gender focal point for Publish What You Pay Senegal in the framework of the Publish What You Pay program on advancing gender and extractives that involves Senegal, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. Welcome, Mariam. And finally, last but not least, Alison Merchant, who's a senior gender advisor for the Open Government Partnership. She manages their thematic work on gender, as well as the Feminist Open Government Initiative, which encourages governments to commit to advancing gender equality and better governance. So I hope I've briefly introduced all of you, and I just want to confirm again that interpretation is available in French and in Portuguese. And please let the Secretariat know in the chat if you have any issues with hearing the interpretation. Before I turn to each panelist and stop talking with specific questions, I just wanted to kind of just say a couple of things to set the tone of today's discussion. And again, reminding maybe everyone of the importance of the topic we're talking about today on advancing gender equality in the extractive sector. I think it's very well established that women tend to bear negative impacts from the sector and are less likely to benefit from it. And that is quite, that has been demonstrated across several fields, and it's not just job opportunities and environmental damage, but it's also in terms of revenues that are issued from the sector, in terms of the opportunities they get to benefit from social expenditures from companies, but also gender-based violence and the fact that they're much more vulnerable to that. And unfortunately, they are very likely to be impacted negatively by the sector, and at the same time, they're way less likely to have a seat at the table and take part in decision making around the way the sector is managed today, but also in the future. And I think Publish What You Pay, alongside a coalition of civil society organizations, has really set the agenda this year, end of last year and this year, by developing a feminist approach to natural resource governance with clear policy imperatives on what has to happen to ensure that women participate in the future of the extractive sector, to be able to influence decision-making around the way the sector is managed, and making sure that particularly the energy transition does not forget to address their needs. And I think, as kind of a concluding remark for this introduction, we just cannot speak of a just transition or of an accountable extractive sector if we're ignoring the voices of women and girls, especially in the more vulnerable communities. So with that, I would like to turn to the panelists, and I would like to start with Lydia for the first round of questions. So Lydia, EITI Madagascar has been one of the first across our implementing countries to disclose employment figures that are disaggregated by gender and by role. And you yourself personally, and I've been very happy to witness it, you've been very active in stating that EITI implementation must take into account women's voice and consider their barriers to participation, particularly at the local level. So we'd really appreciate if you could tell us a bit more about this approach and about its impact and potential achievements, but also limitations.
Bonjour tout le monde, bonjour chers panélistes. Merci Indra pour l'introduction. Oui, effectivement, les problèmes liés à l'égalité hommes-femmes sont nombreux et chacun à son niveau essaie de les atténuer. Une des stratégies que nous utilisons pour faire face à ces problèmes, c'est d'aider les femmes à être autonomes. Et aujourd'hui, je vais vous partager le success story d'un projet pilote initié par la GIZ ou l'Agence allemande de coopération internationale et le gouvernement australien à travers l'Université de Queensland, Australie. En fait, le projet consiste à faire un état des lieux de la situation des femmes dans une localité située au sud de Madagascar et où existent de nombreuses activités de petites mines. Il a été constaté que de nombreuses femmes n'avaient pas d'emploi réel. Pour subvenir à leurs besoins, elles collectaient des pierres brutes qui ne sont pas exportées et les vendaient à des prix dérisoires. Afin de donner aux pierres une valeur ajoutée, avec le soutien financier de la GIZ et du gouvernement australien, un projet pilote a été initié depuis 2015. Un certain nombre de femmes a été identifié. Ce sont des filles mères, divorcées ou veuves. Et le minimum requis était qu'elles savent parler, lire et écrire. Grâce au financement et aux efforts et persévérance de ces femmes, elles ont réussi à se former en association dûment reconnue légalement. Une maison de l'association a été construite, laquelle a été équipée d'eau et d'électricité, d'ordinateurs, de connexion Internet, d'un atelier de lapidaire et de bijouterie, ainsi que d'une vitrine de vente et d'un bureau. Elles ont reçu des formations en lapidairerie, en bijouterie, informatique, en gestion de leurs dépenses et recettes, en photographie des pierres et jusqu'à la façon d'exposer leurs produits de vente. Avec ces moyens, les femmes peuvent aller tailler les pierres ou les transformer en bijouterie. Elles commençaient à vendre leurs produits auprès des touristes et devraient théoriquement s'acheminer vers l'autonomie. Le financement s'est donc terminé vers le milieu de l'année 2020. Mais malheureusement, suite à la crise sanitaire, elles ont été obligées de puiser dans leur trésorerie pour subvenir à leurs besoins quotidiens. Par ailleurs, il n'y avait plus de touristes. Pourtant, elles ont encore besoin d'accompagnement et de formation, telles que les formations en marketing, recherche de débouchés, mentoring, etc. Cependant, malgré la crise sanitaire, elles ont pu quand même obtenir une commande en provenance d'une société australienne et on espère que cette commande sera régulière et qu'elles recevront d'autres. Par ailleurs, des compagnies minières opérant dans le sud du pays se relaient pour les accompagner, l'objectif étant toujours leur autonomie totale. Il a été constaté que ce projet pilote a été réussi et l'étape suivante, c'est de le dupliquer dans d'autres localités du pays. Mais le défi principal, c'est le problème financier, car les zones minières, surtout les petites mines où se trouvent les femmes en difficulté, sont localisées dans des endroits très reculés et difficilement accessibles. Voilà ce que j'aimerais vous partager parce que les efforts déployés par ces femmes qui sont parties de rien ont été louables, sont louables et vraiment méritantes. Merci de votre patience.
Merci mille fois, Lydia. Sorry, thank you so much, Lydia. And don't worry, we didn't have to be patient. It was absolutely fascinating and important. You're raising issues that are related to employment opportunities for women in the artisanal and small scale mining sector. And thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to turn to Melania. Melania from Zimbabwe. And I think through your advocacy work, you've really sought to develop proposals that would be women-driven and women-informed, and around climate development initiatives that really meet the needs of African women in particular. We'd really appreciate if you could share an example with us and kind of lessons learned from one of these examples.
Thank you very much. So let me just start by saying that with this crisis, the climate crisis that Africa is currently facing, mining makes our ecosystems very fragile, and therefore, as much as we really need the minerals, but the challenge is that in times of crisis like what we faced in Zimbabwe during the cyclone Idai, you know, a lot of people perished, and if there is mining which is going on underneath, it means it has to be done differently if people are going to survive. But also, one of the very critical issues is that during this time of droughts and all these climate-induced disasters, mining offers alternative livelihoods for women. Unfortunately, in a lot of instances, the formal mining sector absorbs only a very small number of women. In Zimbabwe, it stands at just 2% of the labor force within the mines are women, and the majority are involved in the informal and artisanal mining sector. The artisanal mining sector, which is largely very informal. And I think what needs to be done is to find ways on how to formalize this. In Zimbabwe and other countries, there's been a lot of efforts in terms of how do we make sure that, you know, there is less criminalization of women who are in artisanal and small scale mining. And also, how do we make the process much easier for women in terms of getting the licenses, getting the environmental and social impact assessments, and as well getting the equipment? How do we make this process easy? And I think one of the areas that really need a lot of work is how do we make sure that all this is done in a way that is transparent? Because the more that the system remains opaque, the more that women are abused within the system. Because we have had cases where women have to give sexual favors for them to get mining licenses, and the violence that is associated with systems which are opaque. But for me, mining provides the much needed revenue. And as well, one of the areas, particularly for organizations like Femnet has done a very powerful and informative research paper on illicit financial flows, and giving also recommendations on how do we make sure that there is tax justice, because the illicit financial flows, when it comes to women's issues, they translate into increased poverty and also lack of access to social services, because the revenue that is lost through the illicit financial flows makes it very difficult for governments to have funds to fund social services like access to water. And therefore, there are quite some powerful recommendations on coming out on coming up with women-driven ways of ensuring transparency within the mining sector, which means having women involved in the whole value chain. And also this also challenging the myth around, you know, women are not knowledgeable about minerals, or women are not knowledgeable about mining, yet research shows that 50% of the artisanal miners in countries like Zimbabwe, the DR Congo, they are actually women. And also given that, you know, women, apart from mining, women also interact with the natural environment in various ways as farmers and also as forest people. And so the alternatives that we are looking at is how do we strengthen the knowledge that women are holding within the natural resource sector, particularly in the mining sector? How do we legitimize these various ways that women are interacting with minerals, with the natural environment, even informing the environmental impact assessments, because so often the mining that is done at artisanal level, on a small scale mining level, though we could say that this is very violent on women's bodies, but one of the things that we cannot run away from is that it has less environmental impact if there's environmental reclamation after that. So I'll just end here, but there's quite a lot that can be discussed in terms of the alternatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melania. And hopefully, if someone could please upload a link to that report from Femnet on the research on illicit financial flows in the chat, I think that would be a really interesting resource for our audience. And just to flag that we've passed 100 participants, so there's obviously a lot of interest for this topic this afternoon. Thank you so much, Melania. I'll turn to Mondo from PWYP Zambia. And in preparing this panel, you had shared with us that you wanted to see a situation where research extraction really benefits the people and keeps in mind the fact that extractive resources are finite. And so how did the campaign that you lead in Zambia really seek to address gender inequality in the mining sector?
Thank you for having me. And maybe to start,
Manda, I'm really sorry. I think there's a bit of a sound issue. Could you try again?
Could you hear me?
We can hear you, but I'm afraid there's some interference.
Okay. Should I just maybe correct that and then we can move on to the next?
I'm really sorry, Manda. It's very difficult to hear you. Maybe can you just check on your side and maybe try to reconnect or check if with your mic, and maybe we can come back to you after the other panelists. Is that okay for you? I'm really sorry. So we'll get back to you, Mondo, and hopefully that can be arranged. And then so I'll turn to Abu Bakr from Guinea. And in the context of Guinea, I understand that back in 2011, the country had adopted a general policy around advancing gender equality, and that as of today, gender issues in the mining sector are really at the center of reforms that your department is pushing for and overseeing. So can you tell us a bit more about these reforms and maybe your department's leadership in pushing for those?
Merci. C'est vraiment avec plaisir que nous participons à ces webinaires-là. Effectivement, il y a beaucoup de réformes dans le secteur minier récemment. Vous savez, le secteur minier a pris beaucoup de poids sur tous les plans en Guinée. C'est le secteur qui a été placé au cœur du développement économique et social de la Guinée. Actuellement, la part du secteur minier dans le PIB est tellement importante que nous souhaitons dans l'avenir que le secteur minier puisse développer les autres secteurs pour que la part du secteur minier soit minime, que les autres secteurs comme le secteur agricole puissent prendre les relais. Mais pour l'instant, le secteur minier reste vraiment le moteur du développement économique du pays. Donc, profitant de cette situation disons, de notoriété, nous avons placé au cœur du développement du secteur minier les aspects JAR, le développement du JAR. Nous avons pensé que cette politique qui permet de tirer les autres secteurs permettra aussi que le JAR, lorsqu'elle marche dans le secteur minier, puisse aussi marcher dans les autres secteurs. le secteur minier a pu, par exemple, faire développer certaines politiques, notamment la politique du contenu local et de RSE, qui est une politique générale, mais le secteur minier a pu développer une politique du contenu local du secteur minier, qui actuellement marche très bien avec la concrétisation de certaines actions. Donc, à travers ce modèle, nous avons pris quand même le devant aussi dans le cadre du JAR dans le secteur minier pour pouvoir tirer aussi les autres secteurs pour créer vraiment une émulation au niveau de tous les départements pour que l'aspect JAR soit pris en compte dans le cadre des industries extractives. Pour cela, il y a eu au niveau du ministère des Mines, en 2016, la création d'un service dédié au JAR. Nous avons ici un service complètement dédié au JAR dans le secteur minier, JAR et équité, qui est doté d'une équipe que nous essayons de renforcer pour qu'elle puisse vraiment pleinement jouer son rôle. Aussi, dans la même politique, il y a eu la création l'année dernière d'un ministère des droits et de l'autonomisation de la femme. Ça n'existait pas. C'est pour vous dire qu'au plan stratégique, au plan le plus haut niveau de la Guinée, cette situation de la prise en compte du JAR est une priorité. En novembre 2020, pour enclencher tout cela dans le secteur minier, à travers un projet de la Banque mondiale, nous avons fait une étude qui était une étude diagnostique sur la problématique du JAR dans le secteur minier. Cette étude a été assortie d'une note de politique de JAR dans le secteur minier. Et cette note a proposé un plan d'action pour 3 ans que nous allons insérer dans notre plan prioritaire de développement du secteur minier. Et les actions qui sont prescrites, qui sont décrites dans ce plan sont assez concrètes. Et donc, nous avons invité tous les autres départements pour partager un peu l'expérience que nous avons eue, pour que dans tous les secteurs, pas seulement les industries extractives, que les aspects JAR soient vraiment une priorité. Maintenant, je vais vous donner des exemples que nous avons mis en œuvre pour que ce soit vraiment une concrétisation sur le terrain. Vous savez, dans le code minier guinéen, les approches JAR n'est pas très claires. Il n'y a pas vraiment des articles qui rentrent dans les détails pour favoriser l'approche JAR dans le secteur minier. Cependant, le même code minier dit que la Guinée a souscrit à toutes les conventions internationales qui vont dans ce sens-là. Cela veut dire tacitement qu'il y a possibilité effectivement d'utiliser ces articles-là pour faire développer certaines choses. Et nous avons donc l'opportunité actuellement de faire des textes d'application pour le code minier, sur le code minier. Et donc, c'est des opportunités effectivement de corriger ces imperfections. Sinon, dans le code minier, en fonction de l'état d'avancement des projets miniers, il y a des quotas qui sont réservés aux Guinéens. Des quotas quand le projet est en phase d'exploration, quand le projet est en phase d'exploitation. Il y a des quotas qui sont réservés aux Guinéens, mais dans ces quotas-là, le nombre de femmes n'est pas défini. C'est juste des Guinéens qui doivent être des membres dirigeants de la société, ainsi de suite. Donc, c'est des opportunités qui s'offrent à nous pour quand même essayer de corriger tout cela. Voilà, donc nous avons créé des fonds ici, les fonds qui sont abondés par les exploitations minières. Il y a notamment le Fonds de développement économique local, le FODEL, qui est un certain pourcentage des chiffres d'affaires des sociétés minières qui sont directement adressés aux communautés impactées par l'exploitation minière. Dans ce fonds, par exemple, nous avons, ce n'est pas dans les textes, mais il a été admis qu'au moins 20% de ces fonds soient alloués directement à des femmes, à des projets portés par des femmes. Ça, c'est des actions concrètes et qui sont applicables. Cela a permis à des dizaines, des centaines de femmes de bénéficier des montants très, très élevés pour leur développement dans des projets, notamment des projets économiques. Voilà, c'est des activités concrètes qui se passent sur le terrain. Et nous avons aussi il y a le fonds qu'on appelle le Fonds national de développement, qui est aussi un fonds qui est constitué de 15% des revenus miniers. Et là aussi, nous essayons de mettre aussi à disposition des femmes pour leur développement personnel. Mais nous sommes confrontés à des difficultés quand même qui restent très compliquées. C'est le niveau d'accessibilité des femmes aux emplois. Voilà, cela est un peu lié à des compétences qui manquent dans certains domaines. Peut-être on y reviendra à d'autres occasions. Je vous remercie.
Merci mille fois, Boubacar. Thank you so much for your intervention and very concrete examples and encouraging plans from the government itself. I just wanted to, we'll get back to you, and all the panelists will have the opportunity to speak again, of course. I just wanted to flag that we've been getting some questions in the chat and in the Q&A section. We'll go back to those in the second round of questions, but participants are interested in kind of understanding women's level of participation and access to decision making. So I think that's definitely an area that we can cover in the Q&A session. I'm not sure Mando is ready to intervene. Mando, could you try again, please, so we can go back to you?
Hello, Indra.
Yes, excellent.
Can you hear me now?
Very well, very clearly. Thank you so much for changing devices. So yes, I was asking you previously. So if you can tell us a bit more about the campaign you lead in Zambia and how that has been, trying to address some of the issues related to gender equality in the mining sector.
Okay, I'd like to begin by probably stating that mining is very important for Zambia. We're predominantly a mining country, and over 70% of our total export revenues come from copper exports. So mining is quite significant for a country like Zambia. But then it's also really sad to note that with over 100 years of this mining activity, there's still some huge disparities in how men and women benefit from the sector. And some of the insights from PWYP Zambia is that the main issue that we have or that we faced is women's being left out from decision-making spaces and actual participation in the mining industry. So there are a couple of interventions that we have. Of course, as PWYP, we've taken the lead in spearheading equal gender representation on decision-making spaces such as the EITI MSG here. So PWYP Zambia currently is Secretariat for Civil Society Representation on the EITI MSG. And we've been looking to change our TORs, to revise them, to ensure that we're taking deliberate steps to ensure that women are represented on these spaces and that are also meaningfully participating. We've done that as well for the PWYP Coalition, where we're revising our governance manuals to that effect. But then I'll go back to what you mentioned, which is the Show Us the Money campaign. It comes out pretty clearly because it's one of, I think, our biggest interventions, which would look at how women participate and how they are going to benefit directly from mining revenues. So the rationale behind the Show Us the Money campaign is that we've had mining in the country for over 100 years, and these mineral resources are finite. So what do we have to show for these mineral resources that we've been extracting for a really long time afterwards? And we're asking, where is the money going? That's what the Show Us the Money campaign is about. And so now we're putting on a gender lens and saying, how are women actually going to benefit directly from the revenues that are coming from the mining sector? One of the ways that we're looking at is diversification. Of course, the mining sector has been predominantly male for a long time, or since its beginning. And till now, we still find the issue of women actually getting employment. So first of all, we have mines not really declaring the figures of women that they're employing, or rather the data is not disaggregated by gender. And that's an issue that we have. Going forward, we hope to ensure that the mining companies are also adhering to that particular requirement to say they should disaggregate their data by gender, and we'll be able to know exactly what women are being involved in mining, are being employed, and what roles they're playing in these mining areas. Then we move on to revenue. So most women are not going to get employed in mining, but we're saying if these revenues could actually be directed towards women and women empowerment initiatives to ensure that they're central to diversification, this would actually ensure a direct benefit to them, and they would also be contributing to the country, to the country's economy. So we're looking at mineral revenue sharing mechanisms. We're also looking at how corporate social initiatives, CSRs, can actually respond to women empowerment issues within the communities. And another thing is we're also targeting the local government to ensure that within the monies that they get from these mining companies, these revenues are actually considering investments in women in mining and women empowerment initiatives to ensure that they drive diversification around mining. Yeah, that's pretty much about the Show Us the Money campaign.
Thank you. Don't say pretty much. It was a lot. You covered really a lot there, it's great that you mentioned kind of the work that Zambia ATI has been doing around improving gender representation on the multi-stakeholder group, and I think we can go back to that. Sorry, because I see the time is moving on, and we still have two panelists that we'd like to hear from before we go towards more of a discussion format. Please, from the audience, we're seeing your questions. I'm noting them down, and they will be answered. So please keep posting them. Mariam from Publish What You Pay Senegal. So you have been the focal point for Publish What You Pay's very own program on advancing gender and extractives. As I said before, that's a program that's implemented in Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Senegal. And it would be really interesting for all the participants here that don't know much about this program, if you could tell us a bit more, and especially on what were the achievements and kind of limitations and what you see as being the next steps now that the program has finalized its first phase.
Bonsoir tout le monde, merci pour cette invitation. Pour répondre à cette question, je vais vous faire part de notre projet pilote sur genre et industrie extractive que nous avons eu à mener. Il faut dire que la coalition PWYP en Afrique de l'Ouest, on travaille conjointement dans un projet visant à renforcer les droits des femmes dans la gouvernance des ressources naturelles. Ces coalitions ont adopté la question du genre sur trois perspectives. D'abord, du point de vue cognitif, il était question pour nous de voir le niveau de connaissance de la question par les membres et de sa prise en compte dans les programmes et projets. Le deuxième niveau a été analysé sous une dimension systémique ou institutionnelle, qui consistait également à voir jusqu'où les femmes participent et sont représentées dans les instances de gouvernance du secteur extractif. Le troisième niveau consistait à voir à travers la norme et les rapports ITIE quelles données seraient pertinentes de publier en vue de renseigner l'impact des activités extractives sur les femmes. Également, sur la base de ces trois objectifs, nous avons mené un certain nombre d'actions qui nous ont permis d'aboutir à des résultats non négligeables. En termes, par exemple, de participation des femmes, nous avons réussi à améliorer considérablement la présence des femmes au niveau des GMP de l'ITIE, mais également au sein des instances de gouvernance de Publier ce que vous payez. Par exemple, nous pouvons donner le cas de la Guinée, où nous avons aujourd'hui une égalité parfaite entre hommes et femmes dans le collège de la société civile. Cela a été possible grâce à l'adoption d'un code de conduite qui requiert une participation substantielle des femmes. Une autre bonne pratique à magnifier, c'est également celle de la coalition du Burkina, où la coalition a réussi à influencer la révision de la stratégie nationale pour l'équité et l'égalité de genre afin de prendre en compte les impacts des activités extractives sur les femmes. Nous ne manquerons pas également de souligner un acquis très remarquable qui est lié à la publication des données sensibles au genre, notamment dans les récents rapports de l'ITIE au Sénégal. Et l'approche qu'on a eu à utiliser, c'est que nous avons réussi à obtenir ces acquis grâce à 3 approches fondamentales, qui sont d'abord la recherche, qui a permis de mettre en évidence les manquements liés à la prise en compte des droits des femmes dans le secteur. À la suite de la recherche, des actions de plaidoyer ont été déterminantes pour acquérir ces avancées. La dernière approche pour nous était de renforcer la capacité des membres et de développer des alliances avec diverses organisations de défense des droits des femmes. Bien sûr, ces approches ont eu des limites quand même. Le premier défi ou limite que nous avons rencontré est que nos organisations membres n'avaient jusque-là pas pris en connaissance les impacts différenciés de l'activité extractive sur les femmes et sur les hommes. Le deuxième défi est que les organisations de femmes et de droits des femmes, malgré qu'elles étaient très actives sur la question du genre depuis, ces organisations ne mettaient pas le lien avec le secteur extractif. Ça a été vraiment une limite. Le troisième défi important est que nous n'avons pas toujours démontré de façon très suffisante l'impact de la publication des données sur les droits des femmes. Et bien évidemment, cette approche, on peut le reproduire. Aujourd'hui, par exemple, si on prend le cadre de la construction des alliances, la construction des alliances figure à notre endroit comme une approche qui peut être expérimentée de diverses situations. Parce que nous avons remarqué que c'est ensemble que nous pouvons être plus forts afin d'influencer les politiques et les pratiques. L'autre défi qui était lié au niveau de connaissance des femmes sur la question des activités extractives et le renforcement de capacités, qui est une action que l'on peut répliquer également dans toutes circonstances, autant pour moi. Voilà le résumé de notre projet pilote qu'on a eu à mener au Sénégal, en Guinée, au Burkina Faso et dans d'autres pays de l'Afrique anglophone. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for this very concise and critical but very constructive assessment of how the project went. I'm going to turn finally to Alison. Hi, and the question I want to ask you, because we've talked before, and I wanted to just ask you about kind of, are there any overlaps between countries' commitments as part of the OGP that relate to the extractive sector and their commitments that are related to advancing gender equality and women's rights? And where you see this overlap or where you don't see it, can you kind of look at the rationale behind it and kind of how we can address that?
Absolutely. And thank you all for having me today, and to my fellow panelists for sharing these really fantastic examples. It's a hard act to follow. So as Indra mentioned, OGP works across governments as a cross-cutting approach to doing government differently, making institutions more open and collaborative and responsive. So within that, the conversation around gender and inclusion and extractive industries is absolutely critical. So despite some real progress in the past couple of years, opening up government remains a relatively unexplored method of accelerating gender equality and closing really critical gaps in information access and participation. We all know that women run companies that bid on government contracts, they work in mines and refineries, they live in communities that are impacted by natural resource extraction and the potential social spillover effects like corruption and gender-based violence. So they should have an equal say and oversight in how governments provide services and oversee those reforms. And that's essentially what we're attempting to do. It's really about shifting power and decision-making back into everyone's hands, which is, I know, something that many of us here in our Francophone governments really share as a value. So to Indra's point, to date, we have 51 governments that have made 146 commitments in extractive industries, and more still on water and sanitation, climate, and the environment. We're fortunate to have partners like Publish What You Pay and EITI who have helped to support some really strong reforms and bring more inclusive voices to these discussions. Worldwide, however, it may come as no surprise that only 3 members have made 3 commitments on extractives and gender, so that intersection of those 2 spaces. And those are Mexico, Nigeria, and the Philippines. This is a very new space for many of our partner governments. These were all made in 2019, for example, and there were none prior to that. Importantly, both Nigeria and the Philippines focus on implementing EITI, so including new EITI standards around women's participation in the multi-stakeholder fora, for example. But we also know that open gender reforms can be really effective in areas that are really valuable and of interest to this community. So areas like economic and legislative reforms, as well as addressing gender-based violence and increasing voice and agency in decision-making. So a couple of quick examples, like open contracting in Kenya, for example. So procurement's a really massive part of the work that we all do. And Kenya used a legislative opening where they legislated that 30% of all government contracts must go to businesses that are owned by women, youth, or persons with disabilities. And so they use their OGP commitment to implement that law. So it's a mechanism for oversight and implementation, which is massive and really important since government contracts and procurement can account for something like 10 to 20% of a country's GDP. We also see reforms like in Canada, who committed to, they want to make their government budget and spending information easier to find and understand, which if anyone's ever looked at a government budget, is a pretty Herculean task. So they used disaggregated data to carry out a gender-based analysis of the budget and to assess how groups like women, men, and gender diverse people are impacted by budget expenditures and tax measures. It made that really open and public. So there's a few different avenues that I think really we could explore further. And I think that there's extreme value in collaborating together to identify some opportunities to use platforms like OGP that really discrete specific commitments can be made and implemented, and that there's an accountability to governments and civil society and private sector working together to really deliver on those commitments.
Thank you so much, Alison, and that's a very interesting figure you shared with us. And there's definitely room for improvement and sharing best practice. So I'd like to thank all our panelists for this first round of questions. And I think you've all touched on very different contexts and very different issues that your work and the approach of your organizations are trying to address. But there's kind of like, if we try to summarize it, you kind of have to work with pilot projects at lots of different levels. From the macro level, from government perspective, all the way to a very localized project, and kind of to underpin that, you need to make sure that there's solid research, and for solid research, you need informed research. So you need information, you need data, and this is something some panelists have touched on. You need strong advocacy and strong commitment from civil society, and really trying to build alliances with actors that are particularly knowledgeable and really know how to what the problem statement is. And again, that's something that all panelists have raised. You need capacity building, and I think it's really important to remember kind of the caveat that was made, that we shouldn't assume that women don't know much about the mining sector. But that they need opportunities to keep building their capacity and then exercise the knowledge that they have through access to employment opportunities. And then finally, we need policies that are favorable for women to have access to decision making, to have access to job opportunities. And I think especially the examples that you highlighted, Abu Bakr from Guinea, were very helpful, and we're hoping that the more and more governments that kind of adopt these progressive policies, those are examples that will kind of be replicated elsewhere. And I think it's what you were saying about, if it works in one sector, it might work in others. And the mining sector can be kind of a leading sector for that, but we can also learn from other sectors where gender equality maybe is a bit more advanced. So I'm just trying to navigate all the open windows on my on my computer. Thank you so much. I've seen that some of you, Lydia and Abubakar, you have been already answering to some of the questions in writing that were asked by participants. And maybe I just wanted to take a question from Mamoudou Konde that you just asked in the chat. Beyond the large-scale mining sector, what should be done today and concretely to strengthen the living conditions and working conditions of women in artisanal and small-scale mining areas? And then the second one is, what's the percentage annually of products and services produced by women and consumed in the extractive sector in the different countries? So I don't know about the second question, if that's something that everyone kind of can answer as of today, but maybe Melania and Lydia, because both of you have raised kind of issues related to artisanal and small-scale mining. Can I maybe ask you to answer to this first question on what concretely has to happen to strengthen and to improve women's conditions and working conditions in the small-scale mining sector? If Melania, you want to jump in?
Thank you very much. I think one of the most important ways of protecting women's rights within the informal mining sector or the less formal mining sector is to make sure that the process is transparent and that we have a set of different requirements for large-scale miners and small-scale miners. Because if we would use the same type, the same list of requirements, that would make the mining extremely expensive for the women who are in artisanal and small-scale mining. And therefore, they will tend to disobey because the requirements are out of reach for them, because small-scale mining is mining that is done with extremely rudimentary equipment, and it often involves the labor of the women directly and sometimes even their families. So this is a livelihood just like, for example, agriculture. And therefore, if we would put some extremely harsh requirements, it means that it's a deterrent for women to come out in the open to say, I'm going to be involved in the small-scale mining sector. So for us to make it safe is to make it transparent in a way that takes into consideration the needs of women, and making even the process of applying for a license less technical, using a language and a format that is accessible to the women, so that they can be able, so that they have no reason for not even having the license. And even the licensing fees, I think in a lot of jurisdictions, they are too exorbitant. So this is what I think. I think it should be more transparent, it should be accessible, it should also be affordable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melania. And Lydia, perhaps you also want to come in, and that would also be the opportunity for you to answer.
Oui, j'aimerais aussi ajouter quelques points pour améliorer concrètement les conditions de vie des femmes dans les zones minières, artisanales surtout. Pour le cas de Madagascar, ces zones minières, je viens de le dire, sont localisées dans des endroits très reculés, difficiles d'accès. Et ce qui manque, je pense, je ne sais pas dans les autres pays, mais ce qui manque, c'est que ces femmes ne connaissent pas leurs droits. Il manque d'éducation minimum de base. Les filles et les garçons ne sont pas éduqués, et ça vraiment, ça les handicape. Ils sont délaissés, ils sont livrés à eux-mêmes, que ce soit les filles, les petits garçons, les femmes, et ils se débrouillent comme ils peuvent. Et ça, moi, je pense qu'il faut il faut des actions vraiment concrètes là-dessus. C'est difficile, mais il faut passer par là, je pense.
Merci beaucoup, Lydia. And indeed, that's I think that's something that's quite recurring in the advocacy work by civil society organizations, kind of insisting on the fact that people should know what their rights are, either when it comes to access to job opportunities, but also their involvement in consultations, for example, around extractive projects. And very often people are not aware of their rights, and that's kind of the start of the problem. Aboubakar, I see you wanted to come in. Just before you come in, I'd also want to...
en fait, ce que je voulais dire, c'est d'encourager un peu aussi les autres activités hors mine. Voilà, les activités génératives de revenus. C'est dans ce cadre que nous encourageons les PME et petites entreprises gérées par les femmes ou des groupements de femmes à aller aussi vers des activités qui peuvent même être des services qu'elles peuvent offrir aux sociétés minières. Voilà, donc nous encourageons vraiment aussi, parce que les activités artisanales, comme l'ont dit mes prédécesseurs, sont très compliquées. C'est très pénible et avec aussi la destruction de la nature, l'utilisation des produits dangereux. Voilà, et donc nous encourageons les femmes à se rediriger vers des activités créatrices de revenus. Ça peut être comme c'est l'agriculture, les maraîchages ou bien d'autres activités qui sont connexes aux mines, qui peuvent être des porteurs pour eux.
Merci beaucoup, Aboubakar. I see that Mariam has raised her hand. Mariam, you want to comment on this topic?
Merci beaucoup, Alice. Je pense que le secteur artisanal est un secteur qui rencontre un certain nombre de défis. Par exemple, le manque d'accès aujourd'hui aux capitaux et au financement des opérations minières auprès des institutions financières classiques. Il y a également un manque d'équipement et de technologie. L'usage du mercure aujourd'hui, c'est très dangereux. Également, le manque d'accès à l'information sur, par exemple, la disponibilité des titres miniers, les difficultés liées à obtenir des permis d'exploitation minière. Pour moi, aujourd'hui, le rôle de la société civile, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, c'est de réfléchir aujourd'hui comment les organisations de la société civile, également certains bailleurs, comment on pourrait les appuyer financièrement, également pour qu'elles puissent obtenir des capitaux. Et également le manque d'équipement, comment on pourrait les équiper aujourd'hui pour qu'elles puissent faire face à l'usage dangereux de certains produits. Et également comment renforcer nos capacités aujourd'hui, parce que c'est des femmes qui ne maîtrisent pas leurs droits, comment aujourd'hui continuer à les appuyer, à renforcer les capacités de ces braves femmes-là pour qu'il y ait des informations dont elles auront besoin aujourd'hui pour pouvoir vraiment continuer à travailler dans ce secteur, également comment améliorer les conditions de vie de ces femmes au niveau de ce secteur artisanal. Merci.
Merci. Thank you so much, Mariam. And sorry, I'm getting very confused with French and English. So I also wanted to, maybe before we move to the second round of kind of questions that I wanted to ask each panelist, I wanted to give Mando and Alison the opportunity to come maybe on one of the questions that was asked in Portuguese in the chat, which relates to local content requirements. Mando, I was wondering if as part of Publish What You Pay Zambia's work, that is something that you have been looking into, because that is very frequently raised as one of the areas where we can really ensure that with local content policies that are gender sensitive, we can get more women in the workspace in the mining sector. And Alison, if you've had any countries that have felt strongly about adding local content requirements to their commitments, and if there's any space to make those gender sensitive. Maybe Mando, you want to come in first?
Pardon me, I think Alison can go first and I'll come in.
Absolutely. So I think that's actually something we haven't seen explicitly within open government commitments, but certainly is, it's one area of trying to direct revenue back into, reinvesting in communities and reinvesting in government. So I think it's certainly something to explore and something that, from a gender perspective would be really exciting to see. I think one thing just in the local context, there's some really exciting opportunities that come through local government. This was mentioned before, but I think we focus a lot at national level efforts, but local governments also have really substantial opportunities to experiment with natural resource governance reforms and consider within their own mandates, what are some ways of capturing some of those revenues and keeping them within cities and areas. So OGP has 50 new local governments who are creating action plans this year. So certainly encourage you to think both locally and nationally about where reforms can be best advanced.
Thank you so much. And Mando, do you want to come in?
Okay. Yes, I can come in now. There haven't been any specific commitments, especially directed towards women, but then we would definitely like to see more of that. And that's why even when we come in with campaigns such as the Show Us the Money campaign, we're targeting central government, of course. The challenge there is whatever mining revenues are paid to the government going to a consolidated fund, and they kind of lose their identity. And directing them towards specific needs, especially those of women, proves a bit challenging. But then when we look at local governments, what we are also targeting, there's a possibility of whatever funds they have being considered more towards, or being directed more towards women in an actually targeted manner, instead of, for this to actually be a consideration, for women to be considered more for investments in women and women empowerment initiatives. So it's something that we are looking at in terms of considerations, but it's something that we haven't seen much progress on.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank the participants that have been asking their questions in the chat. I can see that some participants are regularly raising their hands. Unfortunately, we don't have the function to give you the floor if you're not a panelist. So please ask your questions in writing, and we'll take them up. I'm very sorry we can't activate your microphones in the setting. So I just wanted to move on to the second round of questions. And here we're going to ask our panelists to be kind of more forward-looking and be very innovative in your answers, because this is also the opportunity for us to brainstorm and learning from the lessons of all the different projects and approaches that you've been presenting, and really looking forward and trying to think, what is it that we can all do collectively, or your organizations themselves, or you even personally on a personal level, if that's something that you're happy to share today. What is it that we can do to really push for advancing human rights and gender equality in the extractive sector, and kind of moving beyond what we all know, and I think sometimes we can be kind of preaching to the choir, because we all agree that this is important, but how can we be much more innovative in our thinking, and the kind of approaches that we can adopt? And just while you're thinking about your replies, I just want to share a little bit about the IATI International Secretariat, where I work. We have provisions in the EITI standard that relates to representation on multi-stakeholder groups, that relates to gender employment data that would be gender sensitive, that we have provisions that are related to access to information and women's participation in public debate. But those are just a starting point. They are kind of a minimum that can be considered as what EITI implementing countries should adhere to, but those are just a starting point, and perhaps they're not very ambitious, and that's feedback that we've heard from some of our countries, that this is kind of a minimum, but we should be much more ambitious if we want to make sure that women do have a voice in the way the sector is managed, and especially in the coming decade. And I think we're all here collectively very conscious of the 2030 deadline for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals that is approaching very fast. That's in less than a decade. We're all collectively very aware of the Paris agreements, and the fact that the Paris Agreement, and the fact that we're very far from respecting government commitments there. So if we were to be very ambitious and forward-looking, what is it really that you would say would be a top priority? And because I went in alphabetical order to start with, I will start from the bottom this time. And Alison, please, if you could share a bit, share your thoughts with us.
Wonderful. I think ambitious is a good word for this session. I think we're, as we talk about feminist approaches or truly transformative approaches, we really need to make progress on commitments and initiatives that are ambitious, as well as accountable, structural, and intersectional. So 2 specific areas come to mind. Of course, a shameless plug is if your government is a member of OGP, to consider using the OGP platform to embed many of the public and private sector pledges and legislation that we see around gender and natural resource governance into your action plans. So oftentimes we see big gestures on gender equality from governments, but they lack specificity around implementing agencies, targets, funding, timelines. And we also see really strong national gender and mining strategies that are adopted, or agreements like the Maputo Protocol, but they're largely disconnected from accountability mechanisms. I think similarly, we see extractive or natural resource governance focused commitments that aren't gender mainstreamed. They don't include gender considerations for who will be affected or supported by these reforms, or a diversity of women's voices involved in drafting the commitment itself. So I think those clearly in my mind are a missed opportunity to jointly design and implement gender transformative extractive commitments in partnership with government, civil society, and the private sector. And as we heard from Mando, as well as FemNet in the previous panel, women's groups have a huge wealth of expertise that would really strengthen the design and implementation of these reforms. And so we're limiting our ambition by not having them at the table to inform these next steps. And then secondly, I'd love to see better intersectional open data on gender, age, disability, and ethnicity, especially when it comes to participation in extractive governance structures, as well as procurement and supply chains and job training and outreach. Without that data, we're missing some really rich information about who's impacted, and especially knowing that one woman or man does not have the same experience as another. So I think as much as we can consider really investing in and disaggregating data, that will lead us down to this ambitious path.
Thank you so much, Alison, and very, very concrete proposals there. And participants, please, if you also want to share your ambitious ideas, don't hesitate to do so. We're really happy to share those orally. And for example, now there's a participant from PWYP Liberia that we're just congratulating his colleague from Senegal on the Show Us the Money campaign, and he'd be interested in seeing how that can be replicated in Liberia. So please continue sharing your ideas. So going from Alison to Mariam, again, you've shared with us a lot about the lessons learned from the PWYP program, and kind of looking ahead, thinking about these policy imperatives of the feminist natural resource governance agenda. What would you say would be the most ambitious next steps that you would like to see happen?
Merci Indra. Pour moi, un des aspects, c'est de développer aujourd'hui une véritable culture genre. C'est une idéologie féministe de la gouvernance des ressources naturelles. Comme quelqu'un l'a dit dans le panel de ce matin, je l'ai suivi et je pense que c'est quelque chose d'innovant aujourd'hui qu'on puisse développer une idéologie féministe de la gouvernance des ressources naturelles. Et on doit le développer au sein de nos organisations et également au sein des compagnies minières et des gouvernements, de faire en sorte que la prise en compte des droits des femmes soit une pratique automatique. Et cela pourrait passer par l'élaboration aujourd'hui de directives contraignantes, à l'image aujourd'hui des directives pour la transparence, mais également des directives pour le travail. Je pense que c'est quelque chose qu'on pourra vraiment essayer. Une autre voie à explorer aujourd'hui reste la publication des données sensibles au genre. Ici, l'idée, c'est de démontrer avec des histoires réelles comment, dans chaque domaine de la gouvernance des ressources naturelles, impact sur les femmes, que ce soit la question de la transparence des contrats, les questions liées à l'environnement, les questions liées à l'espace civique, les questions liées à la transformation énergétique. C'est toujours des données à explorer. Et enfin, peut-être mettre l'accent sur le renforcement de capacités des femmes pour mobiliser davantage d'organisations féminines dans la promotion et la protection des droits des femmes. Merci.
Merci mille fois. Sorry, thank you so much. And again, very, very concrete proposals there. And I think that's definitely something that all panelists have in common today, the idea that they wish that gender would just be, thinking about gender and taking into consideration would be something automatic. And there's obviously still a very long way to go, but yeah, so thank you so much for sharing, Miriam. And so I'll go to our next panelist, Abubakar. There's been a lot of questions from the audience to you, and I think that's a testament of the appreciation for what you're sharing today. So yes, what would you say would be ambitious next steps?
Bon, c'est comme si je m'étais un peu entendu avec Mariam, parce que exactement, je partage complètement ce qu'elle a dit. Déjà, nous réfléchissons comment mettre en réseau déjà les services genre et équité des différents départements pour que ce soit vraiment une force de lobbying qui peut porter cette question de genre. Voilà, ça rejoint un peu le premier point qu'elle a soulevé. Aussi, il est important dans le cadre du renforcement des capacités des femmes. Comme vous savez, les mines ne se trouvent pas dans la capitale ici, elles se trouvent dans les régions, mais il y a un vrai problème pour que nos femmes se déplacent vers ces mines-là. Les sociétés minières aussi ont une certaine exigence pour le recrutement. C'est pour ça que le personnel féminin de la société minière est très faible. Donc, il est aussi important dans le cadre du renforcement des capacités de mettre en place un mécanisme de promotion de formation technique dont ont besoin les sociétés minières auprès des femmes, des jeunes et des jeunes filles, des jeunes hommes, pour que au moins l'employabilité dans ces secteurs qui, quand même, par rapport aux autres secteurs, payent bien. Il faut, je crois, aller vers ça aussi, faire la promotion de ces formations-là. Aussi, le dernier point, concernant les informations sensibles au genre. Nous, par exemple, chez nous, ici, nous produisons depuis quelques années des bulletins statistiques sur beaucoup d'indicateurs, voilà, sur les productions, les exportations, les nombres de sociétés, ainsi de suite. Mais on a encore du mal à fournir des informations sensibles au genre. Et actuellement, mon bureau est en train de mettre un mécanisme en place pour effectivement essayer de mettre en place un mécanisme de collecte systématique et de divulgation de ces informations à travers nos bulletins-là. Et ça, ce sont vraiment nos priorités parce que c'est quand les gens sont informés qu'ils sont conscients de la situation. Voilà. Donc, les chiffres là permettront aussi de faire bouger les lignes. Je crois que c'est des propositions concrètes que je peux faire pour essayer d'avancer sur ces questions-là.
Thank you so much, Abubakar. Indeed, very concrete suggestions as well. Demba, I hope you and your team are taking notes because I can't write everything fast enough. So please make sure that all of this is shared in material following this this webinar. I like, you know, the mix between panelists' proposals between very concrete policies and mechanisms that have to be put in place and work more around as well in parallel on the culture and kind of also symbolic actions. We're making sure that gender is something that is mentioned more often in conversations, that you have specific units in place, that we talk about it more. That's something that has to go hand in hand with very concrete mechanisms as well. Mando, please, from Zambia, you've already shared so much with us, but we hope that you have more, and it's not a great thing to be at the bottom of the list when we go through all the panelists, because maybe others have already raised some of the ideas you had, but please, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, Indra. I don't think my ideas will be so much different from what everyone else has brought up. They're all very valid and very, very incredible ideas. As Publish What You Pay in Zambia, we're probably going to continue taking advantage of our seat on the EITI MSG. I believe it's one of the most important decision-making spaces when it comes to extractives, especially on the part of extractive revenues and how they are, how they are used or how they can be redistributed. So as Publish What You Pay in Zambia, our thought is to continue advocating for compliance to the gender standard in the 2019 EITI standard, and ensuring that not only civil society, but the government and also the private sector who are sitting on this MSG begin to comply and actually take into consideration this standard and its provisions to ensure that the rights of women in the extractive industry are actually advanced. Another issue that we've probably noticed continuously is the lack of capacity. We've had situations where an issue comes up with how much technical knowledge do women have to actually contribute meaningfully in these decision-making spaces. So capacity building is definitely something that we need to take forward, to undertake. And Publish What You Pay in Zambia is already trying to work around how we can build the technical capacity of women to meaningfully contribute to extractive discussions and policies and ensure that women's rights are represented rightfully within the extractive sector. I think those are the major issues when it comes to what we'd like to see going forward as the Zambian coalition.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for sharing, Mando. And obviously, I'm very happy to hear that you will keep advancing your work as part of the EITI process in Zambia. And I think it was a comment in the chat as well. It's important for civil society to push for these issues as part of the EITI multi-stakeholder groups, but we should also make sure that the industry constituency and the government constituency also make this a priority. And we're very happy to see in the majority of our countries, it's really civil society that's pushing for this agenda. But we're really hoping that the other two constituencies will really want to follow up on that. And thank you so much, Alison and others, for sharing some resources in the chat. I think there's a lot of material that is constantly being developed around this topic, and we should really make sure that we're pulling together this existing material. That's very helpful. Melania, I'm going to turn to you now. A lot of your background is really on environmental and climate justice, and I think the world is finally kind of waking up to the reality of what's happening on our planet. And how do you really see women's role in ensuring that we can really work towards a just transition in the future?
Thank you very much. I think when given my background, I think when we think around a just transition, I look at it from a feminist perspective, that any just transition should take into consideration women's practical needs, strategic needs, and all the other needs. Because if we are not going to have a feminist perspective, it means that we could transition into a regenerative economy, a climate just economy without gender justice. So I think that there is need for me. I feel that there is need for women to come together, to organize, to define what exactly they require. And I see the liberation of women within the mining sector. I don't see it coming easy, because mining by nature is extremely masculine, and it is a male-dominated space. Because of its nature. So I think that there is need for women to organize across the continent, because Africa is definitely extremely rich in natural resources, but then women are not deriving any benefit out of it, and they are usually, the people who are put on the margins of whatever comes out of that. So I feel that there is need, just like any other struggle for the emancipation of women, that women should come together. The way that was done for women to come up with, for example, the Maputo Protocol, the Geneva Declaration, the Beijing Declaration, and all such spaces. I feel that the same should happen within the mining sector in Africa because I see this, a lot of reforms have been done, and these are coming in piecemeal. And what we are getting within the mining sector is also a piecemeal liberation of women within that sector. So we need something that is really transformative. We need something that really redefines what the mining sector looks like for women. So this is my feeling. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you're the second panelist to use the word transformative. And I think that's really a key word. And PWYP has been, along with a coalition of society musicians, really also they're trying to push for a transformative agenda, and that really underpins the urgency of the situation. Again, last but not least, Lydia from Madagascar, and I think a lot of people are particularly interested also in your point of view as being an industry representative. What do you think really would be an ambitious agenda for the coming years?
Pour ma part, j'aimerais appuyer déjà les propositions déjà citées auparavant par les autres panélistes. La première proposition, c'est le renforcement des capacités. J'ai déjà mentionné tout à l'heure qu'il est important de renforcer la capacité des femmes, des jeunes, mais ça doit commencer par l'éducation de base. Et la plupart des sociétés minières ici à Madagascar se focalisent leur action sur l'éducation de base par la création d'écoles primaires et puis par la formation des personnes directement impactées par le projet en question. Le deuxième point dont j'aimerais aussi appuyer, c'est la prise en compte des droits des femmes de façon concrète par le renforcement du cadre légal. Effectivement, le cadre légal existe autour de l'égalité homme-femme. Par exemple, pour le cas de Madagascar, la Constitution prévoit l'égalité de tous les individus sans discrimination de sexe et l'égalité de droit à la propriété. Il en est de même du Code du travail et le droit foncier admet un droit égal à l'homme et la femme. Là, je mets un accent particulier sur le droit foncier parce qu'il y a toujours le problème foncier rencontre souvent les femmes rencontrent souvent des problèmes fonciers lors des partages des revenus suite à des problèmes culturels surtout et méconnaissance de la loi. Donc, dans la pratique, tous ces exemples de textes légaux ne sont pas appliqués convenablement. Donc, il est important de vulgariser ces textes afin que les hommes et les femmes sachent leurs droits et surtout en milieu rural. Il est préconisé aussi de revoir la législation de manière à prendre en compte les besoins différenciés des hommes et des femmes par rapport au pouvoir. Il peut être proposé le renforcement du contrôle au niveau des entreprises publiques et privées afin que ces derniers adoptent des pratiques d'embauche plus inclusives. L'inclusion, parce que l'inclusion des femmes tout au long du processus de rédaction des textes et de formulation des politiques et cadres est encouragée. Il faudra également renforcer la politique du contenu local, ça a été déjà dit auparavant, en considérant les femmes en tant qu'acteurs et bénéficiaires des avantages du secteur. J'aimerais donner l'exemple ici du principe de budget participatif car ça a été un succès ici, il y a un exemple concret là-dessus. par rapport à un projet ici à Madagascar. Il faudra également, pour ce qui concerne le foncier que j'ai mentionné dans le texte légal a été mentionné plus haut, il faudra veiller à l'application concrète des textes afin que les femmes aient les mêmes droits que les hommes. Ceci est important dans les activités extractives en cas de compensation lors des déplacements de population. Le plus souvent, quand on fait des rencontres, des consultations publiques, les femmes n'ont pas droit à la parole, elles écoutent, elles ne disent rien, et c'est toujours l'homme qui décide pour tout le monde, pour toute la famille, pour toute la communauté. Et moi, à mon avis, il faut que tout cela s'arrête et que l'homme et la femme aient ont tous le même droit de s'exprimer et de bénéficier des revenus, bénéficier également des revenus provenant du secteur extractif. Donc, il faudra assurer la non-discrimination des femmes par la création peut-être des femmes agents de liaison qui seront en contact direct avec les femmes, se sentant éventuellement intimidées parce que les femmes malgaches sont très, très timides, surtout dans les milieux ruraux.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And I think you also raised a huge topic here that we unfortunately haven't had the time to address is around land and territory rights and compensation for it. And how unfortunately women very often are disadvantaged in this situation as you raised. We're noting also what you mentioned around participatory budgeting, and in the comments, unfortunately, we're very sorry we won't be able to address those because we've run out of time, but a proposal on establishing strategies to link women in rural settings with other governance structures, and we've seen particularly at the ITI that very often those are led by actors in capitals and in urban settings. So very important to be able to establish that link. And another proposal that I think is really absolutely fascinating is whether or not there's a percentage of revenue that is dedicated, so extractive revenues, that is dedicated to promoting women empowerment in extractive communities. I think, again, that's something that's very interesting, and hopefully that governments are to adopt. I am so sorry I've run out of time. I have to give the floor to the PWYP Secretariat for a conclusion, but I just wanted to say that, and I am not summarizing today's very, very rich discussion in just one sentence, but I just wanted to say that it's really important that we all agree that we need very progressive policies, both from government and companies, and that's the only way that we can advance with a very equitable sharing of resources in the sector, and especially in the broader shift in the coming years around energy transition and recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, and all the work that PWYP and other civil society organizations have been doing and through their advocacy work is essential for the adoption of these policies. So Demba and your team, I understand that you just you wanted a couple more minutes to be able to share something with participants, and I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart the panelists today and the audience for staying throughout the session, which I really thought was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, this is fine, Indra. Congratulations for the great facilitation and the great panelists you've had on this session. I just wanted to remind people that we are having other sessions coming on in the next couple of hours, maybe tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. GMT. And I'm handing over to Sandrine, but just wanted to mention that the links you were asking Sandrine will be shared by Mando later, because she needs to have the go-ahead from FAMNet before sharing those links. Thanks. So up to you, Sandrine.
Thank you, Demba. Thank you, Indra. Thank you to all the panelists for such a rich conversation. It was extremely interesting. I just, wanted to let you know that as part of the Africa Conference, we have another 3 sessions starting tomorrow at 9, and I'll put them up on the screen now. If you haven't registered yet, we can send those links in the chat as well, so that you can register for those. And also just a quick note on our survey that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar. It will appear in English, so I will put the links in the other languages in the chat, so in French and Portuguese. And if you could just please dedicate a couple of minutes to the surveys, this is very helpful for us. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I'll put those surveys in the chat, and then I will end the webinar. And again, thank you so much, everybody, today.